Let's get to know this player a little bit. This player is Gavin LeBlanc. He's an NAI pitcher. He's 21, so he's a senior. So really this is his last shot. He's got one more year to go at it. A couple weeks ago, we ran a contest where we collected video submissions from our followers, from you guys, and we selected a college pitcher who we're gonna be breaking down today. So let's go through his mechanics together. We're gonna be trying to figure out how we can take this NAI pitcher who's throwing 88 to 92 miles an hour and what that path could look like for him to be a professional pitcher over the next 12 months. We're gonna outline a full phase of training and how that might come together if he did end up being one of our athletes. And you guys are gonna be able to follow along as we break down his strength and power metrics, break down his mobility, break down his mechanics, break down his pitch design, and his entire arsenal to see how all the different pieces come together. Before we get into it, I'm Ben Brewster, co-founder of Tread Athletics. We train thousands of high school, college, and professional pitchers, both in-house and remotely all over the world. Let's dive in. As we get in, just recognizing there is no such thing as perfect mechanics, so we're not gonna be comparing to some perfect pinnacle of what mechanics should be. We're really looking at, is this athlete moving in relation to how their natural preferences would dictate, if they're a rotator, if they're a tilter, are they a supinator, are they a pronator, and just trying to figure out, is he moving in an efficient way for his body type? Second, looking at how we can give you guys a preview of how we approach the problem at Tread from a number of different perspectives, not just looking at it from mechanics, but looking at it from how all the different pieces come together. And then third, recognizing we don't have a full scope of data on this athlete. This was just the very tip of the iceberg as far as doing a sample, a quick assessment, and having him go through a movement screen, having him go through a few different questionnaires. But again, just a very small segment and a small sliver of the information we would truly have at our fingertips. Certainly for a pro that has all these advanced analytics already at our fingertips, and then also for somebody we were able to actually assess in-house and go through our entire remote process with. So let's get to know this player a little bit. This player is Gavin LeBlanc. He's an NAI pitcher. He's 21, so he's a senior. So really this is his last shot. He's got one more year to go at it. He's 6'2", 204 pounds. He's a lefty. He's 88-91, up to 92 miles an hour. He's a relatively low slot lefty. Again, goal, everybody's goal, play professionally. And we selected him because we felt he was a good example of kind of a stock college pitcher. Again, everyone's goal, play professionally. But a guy who really is, I think, one or two tweaks away from potentially making that happen and really being a signable type college pitcher. So as far as what we got from him, we got mechanical video, pitch data, a little bit of injury history. We got an abbreviated movement screen. We got some of his strength and power metrics self-reported. We got a sample nutrition and food log from him, and we had a sample mental profile that he filled out as well for the sake of this video. As far as injury history goes, he's a guy who has really stayed relatively healthy over the course of his career. The one major thing that he did report is that he had a lumbar stress fracture, so spondylolysis sophomore year. And he said that that was primarily from front squatting. We're gonna take a look at his mechanics as well and see if we can't connect the dots a little bit, but that was a front squatting related injury as far as he reported. As we go into understanding the scope of his problem, how did he perform over the last couple of years over his college career? He's had a history of command issues if we take a look at his stats. So roughly 5 walks per 9 in 2024. He does have positive trends in his overall numbers. So from 2022 to 2024, he's improved his ERA from in the 8 range in 2022 and 2023 at a Division II to under 3, again, at an NAI in 2024. So positive trends there, positive trends from a whiff rate as well. So his stuff seems to have improved. Roughly 8 strikeouts per 9 to over 12 strikeouts per 9 in 2024. So things are trending in the right direction, but again, stuff is gonna have to continue to get better. We're gonna have to be able to figure out how do we add 3 ticks from where he's at? How do we drop that walk rate from ballpark 5 walks per 9 to 2 to 3 walks per 9 to be a legitimate draft prospect, or at least a signable free agent. We're gonna have to get him in the 92-95 range. And we're also gonna have to be able to figure out what can we do to round out his arsenal as well. How can we take his existing arsenal and just make it a little bit better? Maybe it's adding a pitch, maybe it's subtracting a pitch, maybe it's adding a little bit of depth. So we're gonna go through that entire pitch design process and some different sample grips that he might be able to try and that you guys might be able to learn from as well. So let's get into it and let's see if we can't connect the puzzle pieces to figure out how we can help this college pitcher play professionally over the next 12 months. So let's start off by looking through the data and the pitch design aspect. So again, we don't have a ton of data to go on. We have some self-reported metrics and screenshots that we plugged into a little spreadsheet here because we haven't been able to get them in-house. But first, we can start with the four seam and start to look at some of these different pitch shapes. So if we look at the four seam, he's got good vertical break on this, good vertical approach angle. If we look here, he's right around 17 inches of vertical break and right around 10 inches of arm side movement. So this is a higher efficiency pitch. He's a low to mid 3/4 slot. He's more of a pronator because this is a little bit of a higher efficiency pitch. Again, you can see in the video the action he's getting. He's getting a fairly decent ride on this from a fairly low slot. So this isn't a bad pitch. Again, if this can play up closer to that 92 to 95 mile an hour range, there's certainly big league pitchers, lefties that fall into that range as far as fastball profile. If we move down a little bit and we look at his sinker, you'll see it's same velocity, good horizontal break. So he's getting up to 18 inches of arm side, which is a good amount of arm side. The one thing I'll say with this pitch is if he can figure out a way to add a little bit more depth to that sinker, if he can kill a little bit more vert and go from something like 11 vertical break, again, knowing he is a high efficiency guy, if we can drop that, get a little bit more sink and get in more of that 5 to 7 inches of vertical break range, that's going to significantly play up, and that's going to induce more ground balls and be able to get a little bit below the barrel as well. He's got minimal seam shifted wake as a pronator. So when guys are very high efficiency, they're very through the back of the baseball, as opposed to getting that slight inefficient spin that generates that seam shifted wake. So one potential option for him, rather than trying to force seam shift, rather than trying to force him to be something he's not and be a supination dominant pitcher, one option would actually be to throw more of a one seam grip. And so there's a few different one seam grips, but just taking that two seam grip and playing with different one seam variations where he's right on that seam or he's splitting the seam, and just see, can that actually generate a little bit more depth or a little bit more arm side from what he's doing right now with just a standard two seam. If we take a look at his changeup, recognizing that he is going to be more of a pronator, so it's no surprise he's got a pretty good changeup. I would argue just purely based on the shape, this is arguably his best pitch. So 3 vert, -14 horizontal, he's getting a lot of depth, he's getting a good amount of arm side on that pitch. And if he's having success with those traditional pronation dominant changeup cues, I wouldn't change anything. But for those of you watching who aren't able to pronate and get a good changeup, recognizing you could still benefit a lot from a little bit more seam shift type cues, where instead of trying to pronate the changeup, you can kind of swipe through it, come through it, and generate a little bit more of that seam shift. If anything, this is a pitch I'd probably throw a little bit more than he is right now. He's right around 15% usage as potentially one of his best pitches, at least based on all we know, by velocity, by movement, by usage. It's probably a pitch he should throw more, but we'd have to gather some more information, see what the end zone rates are. We just don't have the advanced analytics to really be able to tell at this point in time, but seems like a good pitch. If we look at his slider, he's throwing a sweeper 2 grip, as I would consider. So traditional sweeper grip would be right on the 2 seam, and you're going to be right on the inside of those laces and really getting around it and throwing that like a curveball, getting on the side of that ball. So in his case, he's a pronator, so he's likely going to have trouble getting to max supination throwing pitches like that. But how is he able to still get fairly good horizontal break on that slider? So he's throwing on the bottom of that horseshoe. So he's right here when he submitted his grip videos, and then he's adding a spike. And the spike is important for pronators. As a pronator, you're going to have trouble getting to max supination in a lot of cases. You're going to have trouble getting all the way to full supination. And so we can get the index finger out of the way, and we can use the spike to still be able to leverage and get to that gyro and get to that side spin. So again, leveraging a spike, super smart if you're trying to throw a sweeper slider as a pronator. And again, this grip, this sweeper 2 grip, is typically going to get a lot more horizontal, a lot more sweep than throwing a slider down here. This is typically going to get you more depth. This is typically going to get you more sweep. And so again, I like that as a slider. Still need to throw something a little bit tighter, a little bit sharper, that generates a little bit less sweep. And so we'll talk more about that in a second. He's been experimenting with a curveball. So we look at those curveball metrics, about -8, -16, as far as the vertical break and as far as the horizontal break. So this is a pretty big, depthy curveball that he could potentially dump in for a strike. It's probably not going to perform super well if he uses it in higher usages. This is more like a kind of Clayton Kershaw-esque shape, where it's really just useful in those low usages, dump in for a strike, kind of like a freeze pitch. Even if we are able to get him to, let's say, 92, 95 miles an hour, this pitch still projects to be in that 75 to 79, 76 to 80 mile an hour range. We really want to see curveballs ideally get over that 80 mile an hour threshold. That's a big inflection point when curveballs really start to up the outcomes in games and the whiff rate starts to go up. So if we can't get a curveball shape to be over 80 miles an hour, we should probably try to figure out how do we tighten it up a little bit. And so this is where I would suggest potentially scrapping that pitch, which he's still just kind of trying to develop it. I would potentially suggest scrapping it, and can we add something a little bit sharper? So we can zoom in here and we can say, okay, what are some different options to get something that's more of a bridge pitch? We don't necessarily need big sweep, especially when we're a lefty throwing against righties, right? We know those big sweeping pitches aren't necessarily going to play as well with opposite-handed hitters. So can we get something a little bit sharper? So maybe that's a cutter, maybe that's a gyro slider, or maybe that's a death ball. But something that doesn't have to move so much could potentially be a very solid idea. So let's see what that could look like. So as a cutter, we're probably looking at something in the 5 vert, 0 horizontal range. So what might that look like? Well, if we take our traditional 4-seam grip, again, depending on how you grip it, you're just going to take that initial grip and offset it slightly with a little bit more middle finger pressure. And this is going to be your traditional kind of Mariano Rivera cutter. Now for a pronator, a lot of these guys, Clase, Rivera, these guys are natural supinators. They can just think 4-seam, throw it. and they're naturally a little bit on the side of the ball, and that's where they get the cut. As a pronator with a high efficiency four seam, you're probably going to have to bias a little bit more middle finger pressure because you're not going to be a supinator. So for those watching who are pronators, I actually prefer being on this side of the four seam. So as you twist it, now you have a seam to rip through. So now you're going to get a little bit more middle finger interaction with that ball, and that middle finger is what's going to promote that slight bit of inefficient spin, that slight bit of gyro spin. The index finger is going to promote that backspin. So we're trying to get the index finger a little bit off the middle of the ball and not have so much play on the back of the baseball, right? A highly efficient four seam, you're gonna have both fingers ripping through the back of the baseball fairly evenly. With a cutter or with an inefficient four seam fastball, you really wanna have a little bit more contribution, maybe 60-40 from the middle finger, a little bit less from the index finger. So we take a regular four seam grip, we turn it just slightly, you'd have this seam to work through, and you're still gonna throw it like a fastball, but now you have just a little bit more contribution from the middle finger, and that's gonna come off with backspin and with a little bit of gyro spin as well, and seeing can we get that pitch to about 5 vert, 0 or even -2 from a horizontal amount of sweep. That's one option. You can certainly play with that in catch play. Second option is a gyro slider. So again, he already throws a slider, but it's a fairly sweepy slider with about 9 inches of horizontal. So 0-0, something that's more of a downer, more that can play off that carry four seam to righties and move more straight down. So what might that look like? Well, that's probably going to look like this, 0-0. So how might you throw that? What's a traditional way to throw that pitch? Well, you're just going to go on the bottom of the horseshoe, just like this. Now, for a pronator, this alone probably isn't going to get nearly enough motion, enough movement. It might, but a lot of times you have to add some degree of spike. The more spike that you have on this pitch, the more depth you're going to get. So a full spike or even a full knuckle. This was Will Vest's slider for a long time. This is something that's going to get you a little bit more depth. Again, as you reduce the amount of spike that you have, this is going to get you a little more velocity and a little bit less shape. So playing around with how much spike, and then also playing around with how much supination. So this is not a pitch, a gyro slider, you're not going to try to go max supination and throw it like a curveball, but you also don't want to be straight behind it like a cutter. So one way I've thought about this pitch and teaching this pitch is thinking about more like creating the U between your thumb and your index and middle finger. So it's kind of in between. If this is 100% efficiency, this is a full, highly efficient curveball. What's the in-between? The in-between is thinking about the U, kind of like the Miami U. And so that cue, that feel at release, and then ripping diagonally through. So it's like you're throwing a football spiral and you're ripping diagonally across the zone. That's a good starting point, a good cue to see if you can't get that just amount of supination to get that shape. If you're not having success, and if you're trying to throw a gyro slider, you're not having success on the bottom of the horseshoe here, play with the amount of spike, play with more middle finger pressure to create more shape. What you can do is you can flip the ball around and now you're on the top of the horseshoe. And so this is the other way that you can play with the gyro slider shape. But again, likely going from somewhere in the 2 to -2 range, somewhere in the 0 inches of sweep to -2 inches of sweep, but somewhere right around here. And the final option, which again would be an acceptable outcome for this pitch, would be, again, curveball, but a little bit sharper of a curveball, so more of a death ball. So when we say death ball, we're thinking about something that's more like -5 inches of vert, relatively minimal sweep. So something like 0 inches of sweep, -5 inches of vert. This would also be a very effective pitch if it's a pitch he's able to learn. So something like this, more of a true downer. And again, that's typically going to be that first grip for the gyro slider, a little bit more of a spike. But instead of thinking about more of the U, you're thinking about getting to more of the front side of the baseball. So you're more thinking about getting just to that front corner of the baseball, ripping down, but you're not all the way here. It's somewhere in between there. You're still getting to that front corner, ripping down, letting the spike do the work. So it'll just be kind of an ongoing trial and error process to figure out what that bridge pitch would be, but somewhere in here, and ideally a pitch he can throw in that 82 to 86 mile an hour range, as opposed to this slightly slower slider that he has right now, 78 to 82. So now let's talk through his mechanics, talk through his patterns, and see if we can't figure out how might he throw 2 or 3 miles an hour harder, just based on mechanical efficiency alone. So if we can start just playing through his mechanics a couple times here, just observe how he generally moves as a pitcher. He's relatively athletic. You can see he's a good athlete. He's got a quick arm, fast arm. He's a relatively loose mover. These are some of the initial things you just look at. Fairly fast tempo. Could be a little bit faster, but these are some of the initial things you see just watching through in full speed. And it's one of the reasons that I don't necessarily like watching in slow motion at first. I want to get a feel for the rhythm, the tempo of a guy's delivery and how the energy generally flows through his body before starting to slow it down frame by frame. If we now do that and we kind of go through step by step in his delivery, let's start with a leg lift. And so in the leg lift, one of the first things we're looking for is, do they stay stacked? So does their pelvis and their torso keep that relationship as they move forward, pelvis, torso, or do they tip forward and tip uphill? And the other thing we're looking for is there a forward move? Is there a forward shifting of the center of mass? And we can see, we draw a line here. We can see that as he lifts his leg, there's really no initiation of that center of mass. He's essentially coming to a balance point, and from there, he's dropping into more of a vertical shin position. So rather than getting that initial drift going forward, he's getting stalled over the rubber, he's coming to a balance point. The problem then is from there, it's very difficult to initiate your center of mass. You kind of have two options. What a lot of guys do from here is they end up reaching forward, tipping uphill, and then at landing, their pelvis is still uphill, their trunk's still uphill, and their elbow is low, arm is often late. That's what happens for a lot of guys. In his case, he doesn't do that, but his very next move is to keep his back foot stuck in a little bit of external rotation and hold a vertical shin. So he doesn't actually get much tension wound through the backside, and he doesn't have as great of a first move as we'd like to see. So he's coming to a balance point, and then his next move is to sink down into his back leg, and he's holding that vertical shin back right here, as opposed to winding tension through the backside. So what I prefer to see, what's worth testing for him, is rather than that back foot being a little bit externally rotated, keep that back foot even. And from here, think about as he gets a first move, he's shifting his weight, he's getting that drift, but he's dropping into the backside. There's tension in the backside. So he's winding that three-dimensional tension over the back hip. Again, doesn't have to be a crazy positive shin angle, but that huge vertical shin, you essentially lose any tension that you would have otherwise in the back hip. So this is something a lot of guys have been taught. It's something I typically disagree with for most pitchers. In his case, he's got good internal rotation. So we can show his hip rotation screen here. He's got a lot of hip internal rotation. So he has the ability to wind a little bit more tension in the backside. When he's just hanging out here in that vertical shin position, he really loses the ability to wind tension and gain maximum stability over the back hip. When he can gain that max stability over the back hip, now he actually has wound the springs. He can hold that spring as he moves down the mound. Now he has something to be able to unload. He can unload the springs because he's properly wound the springs. So that's how you really get into the ground, gain stability in your back hip, and then you're trying to hold that tension that you've created down the mound, down your stride. Now you have something to unload ultra late and feel that energy funnel up the chain. That's the linear move. We'll play this through a little bit more from the side. Again, you can see this vertical shin right here. He really just kind of stays stuck and back over the rubber. Can we improve that first move? Can we improve that overall tempo with that drift and with winding more tension through the back leg? If we look at the back view, the other thing that's worth pointing out is you can see this gravity line. I call this more of an anterior gravity line, but he's really forward with his posture and he's really into the toe. And so again, this isn't always an issue, especially lower slot guys are typically gonna have a little bit more of a forward posture angle. They're gonna be here, and as they rotate, they're typically gonna be, again, somewhere in a little bit lower slot. But he's trying to get to more of a 3/4 slot, but he's trying to do that from this very hunched over position. One of the things I'm interested in is, can we get him a little bit more upright with his posture in a little bit more stacked position? And would that help him direct more energy downhill through the back of the baseball and tick up a little bit? Rather than his linear move starting to dump forward and bring him into landing this way, where he's getting stuck here and then trying to climb to the higher slot, can we just bring him into a little bit more stacked position, less anterior tilt, hips underneath him, torso stacked, and then as he rises back hip down the mound, he's already in that upright stacked position, holding tension. He can unload the tension. Arm is going to be able to actually flip up, get in a better position, and unfurl downhill quite a bit easier than trying to work against him when he's down here. He's in that anterior tipped position, and now his arm is just working against gravity to try to fight to climb up and get to that higher release point. This is mirrored in his assessment, where you can see, if we look at his posture in his assessment, he's already in that slightly anterior tip position. So he's already leaned forward, a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt, hinging a little bit through that low back where he's had low back issues, and he's already tipped here. So can we get him, even just generally posturally, get him a little bit out of that position, more center through the feet, a little bit more neutral pelvic position, a little bit more stacked torso position. And that's an area we might be able to attack from a mobility standpoint in the weight room, and then also should clean up some of the aspects in his delivery as well. So I would definitely experiment with getting him in a more stacked position. It might creep up his slot a little bit, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. We can see how his velocity responds, we can see how his vertical break on his fastball responds, and we can see how the rest of his arsenal responds to split testing that while we still have some time left in the offseason. So now let's look at hip rotation. One of the first things you'll see is that as a result of the initial setup in the throw, his back leg gets a little bit extendy. So he's getting a little bit of extension into landing, and that's affecting the ability to get that crisp late unload of the hips, and that funnels its way up the chain. So you can see his back leg gets a little bit stuck. If we look here on video, his back leg's not necessarily fully turning over. He's not getting the hips through. And we also look at the effect that it's having on his torso. And so you're gonna see relatively minimal separation between the pelvis and between the torso. Now, some guys are just gonna be tighter wound guys. They're not gonna have as much range of motion. They're not gonna necessarily be able to get into significant positions of hip-shoulder separation. But if we look at his movement screen, you actually see he does have a lot of thoracic rotation. He is a relatively loose mover. He does have that range. So what I think is happening is because he's so forward in landing, he's kind of fighting against himself, and he's not able to really dissociate as well as he otherwise would. He's getting a little bit extendy. The back foot is getting a little bit stuck. He's not able to clear the hips, and because he's forward, he's not able to let the T-spine actually work as well as it otherwise could. Again, I think getting him a little bit more upright, a little bit more stacked, he'll be able to get that back hip through. He'll be able to actually generate a little bit more of a stretch in his obliques and in that entire, that fascial sling, and the arms should be able to get up on time and work a little bit better downhill. One interesting thing, if we look at his movement screen, his gait assessment, so just watching how he walks, you'll see that he doesn't really have a lot of motion between his hips and between his T-spine. He's kind of just like walking very stiff. Again, that just could be how he happened to do the assessment. What you want to see though is a little bit of counter movement between the hips, between the torso. As the hips rotate, the torso counter rotates. And so there's actually this dissociation happening as they walk between the hips and between the torso. So he has the range, but it could be that patterning a little bit more dissociation work in his mobility routine could be helpful to help him learn how to relax and rotate the hips from the torso independently. So now we get to the block. And with the block, really this is all downstream effects of what's happening at the start of the throw. So we kind of know we're not going to be directly addressing the block from the block itself, but this is still going to give us clues as to what happened earlier in the throw and maybe how he's effectively transferring energy up the chain using the ground, using the lead leg. And so what we want to see is that when that lead leg hits, it doesn't continue to sink forward, it doesn't bow out, and he doesn't sink down into that lead leg. So ideally, this knee hits and it doesn't sink, it doesn't bow, and he doesn't sink deeper into it. Ideally, you continue rotating, that knee extends, blocks, braces, and sends the upper half over the front side. So let's see what happens. And you'll see the very first thing after landing, that knee has maybe 2-3 inches that it sinks forward. And so that's a sign he's not getting a super effective block. He's dissipating some of that potential energy and momentum into the ground as opposed to sending it up the chain as effectively as he could. The other clue that he's not separating and segmenting and funneling the energy up the chain as well as he could is the back leg. And so you'll see this back foot shoots off the rubber, the back knee shoots forward as the torso rotates. And so rather than getting this crisp unload hips, torso, he's getting a little bit of rotation together. So he gets a little bit stuck here, he's a little bit forward, and this back hip and the torso rotate together. That back foot shoots off the ground, the knee shoots forward, and he's basically rotating the back hip and the torso together as opposed to that clean segmentation, hips, torso, arm, which is what we ideally want. And that comes from the first move, that comes from loading tension, loading the springs, so you have something to cleanly unload from the ground up. If we look at his arm, what are we looking for in the arm? Ideally, we want the arm to be up, back, in a scap retracted position, in a relaxed position, and in line with the torso at landing. Now, he does a fairly good job of that. You can see the arm is relatively up. Unfortunately, he's not getting into nearly as much retraction as he should be able to from his movement screen. And so, I think if he's able to get into more of an upright posture, his arm's gonna have more room to work behind his body as opposed to fighting against gravity, really not able to get into the same positions he might otherwise be able to. Again, totally fine if that's your profile as a pitcher. If you need to be a forward torso guy, if you're gonna be a low slot guy, it's just part of the game. But as a relatively undersized guy who's trying to figure out how can he throw 95 to have a shot, I think that's gonna be one of his quickest and best ways to get a shot as a lefty is being able to touch mid-90s. We can see here as he begins to rotate, ideally, if you're able to get the arm up, back, and relax, now you can get a big pull into ball release from the pec. And what happens and how the scap retraction actually works is if the arm is able to relax, get up and back in plane and landing, scap retraction is primarily happening from the arm being left behind as the torso rotates. And so you're screwing into scap retraction as the torso rotates and leaves behind the arm. If the arm is super tense, then as the torso rotates, it brings the arm with it, and the arm ends up hitting peak layback out in front of the face or climbing up above the line of the shoulders. And again, ideally, the arm is left behind. That creates a big stretch shortening cycle through the chest, and you're able to then whip and pull the ball into release from the pec and from the lat. That's what we want to see. What are we actually seeing? We're seeing a slight push here. He's got plenty of range of motion. His arm is mobile, but he's getting a little bit pushy, and you can see that layback is happening way in front of the face. He's not getting that pull and that spiral out into ball release that we'd ideally want to see. If you look at it from the back view, another telltale sign that he's getting a little bit pushy, a little bit out of plane, is that elbow has a tendency to creep up a little bit as opposed to staying in line with the shoulders. We want that arm to stay in line with the shoulders. Again, whether the trunk is here, in line, or here, in line, we want those things to match. We don't want the arm up above plane, even for a couple frames. If we look here, you'll see that torso is in roughly this plane, and the arm is up here. So he doesn't quite get the arm to stay in plane for the entire duration of that hip and trunk rotation. He does get the arm back in plane 2 frames later, but again, that's just that slight inefficiency that we ideally want to make sure that arm stays in plane for as much of that rotational phase as possible. So to summarize the mechanics and what I'm seeing, the top 4 things I would say are: 1, lack of drift, making sure that we can add a little bit of forward momentum during that first move, which is going to set up better positions for the rest of the throw. We can't separate this from the drift, but that second piece is lack of back hip tension. So making sure as he's coming out of leg lift, he's still finding a way to wind and load some degree of tension. If he's not able to even feel or understand what tension is, we have certainly a number of videos describing how to initially feel tension and what that back hip tension should feel like. But just making sure if we can wind springs a little bit better, that should help him have a crisper unload. The block should improve, that back leg shooting off should improve, that elbow pushing should improve as well. Lack of posture, again, might have to happen in the mobility side of his program in the weight room, but making sure we can't get that weight a little bit more underneath him, torso and pelvis a little bit more stacked, it should let his arm get in better positions and work downhill and get a better pull and ball release. And then 4, I really think the arm should take care of itself if we're able to address those first 3. So it's going to have more room to flip up, more room to get into scap retraction, more room to get a clean pull downhill into ball release, and it should help the rest of the arsenal be a little bit more crisp as well. So I don't think we need to primarily address this from an arm standpoint. I think we can address it from a posture and a lower half standpoint, and we should see the rest of the throw start to clean up as well. So now let's take a look at his mobility screen and see if we can't connect some of the dots a little bit further. So overall, he's a guy who has a lot of motion. He's what I would consider a looser mover. Probably not gonna have to focus on mobility nearly as much as those of you watching who classify more as the tighter mover type guys. But one thing that's concerning that I wanted to dive deeper on is he has that history of a low back stress fracture a couple of years ago, which he said was from front squatting. So what are some potential connections we can draw from that? Well, if we look at his general postural assessment from the side, we can kind of see he already has a little bit of extension. He's already in that forward posture, which is going to set him into a little bit more extension through his low back to be able to stay upright and stay balanced. So that's one thing we're already concerned about, potentially putting a little bit more stress on the back of the spine by being in that extended posture. Now we load that with a ton of load on a front squat, on a back squat, and knowing a front squat is going to put us in even more of that posture, whereas a back squat, you're going to be a little bit less in that extreme extension. So knowing that might be a risk factor right there. We look at his spinal screen, realizing we're trying to see how does his spine move in flexion, in extension, and side to side in lateral flexion. You can see he's got a lot of range of motion in extension, but he's really concentrating that stress at a couple segments in his spine, which I'm willing to bet one of those segments is where he had that stress fracture. We just don't have that level of detail from him at this point in time. And then we look at him from a shoulder flexion standpoint. Ideally, we want really clean overhead motion from the shoulder without compensating from the low back or from the mid back. And so again, he has a compensation there as well, which all of these clues are pointing to. He probably needs to get out of that extreme extension and be able to learn how to keep his hips and his rib cage in a more stacked position, cueing more ribs down on his rowing, cueing more ribs down on his squatting, cueing more ribs down on his pressing, and just maintaining that relationship to take some of that load off the back of his spine, off those facet joints, which are going to run into each other and potentially be re-aggravated again like they did in the past if he doesn't make some adjustments to his posture and make some adjustments to how he moves in the weight room as well. On top of that, the only other slight yellow flags that we saw, we run through a number of tissue tests with our guys. So there's a number of points throughout the body, where we're looking for, is there sensitivity, is there density, is there grittiness, are those typical tissue points that we see that are super important for staying healthy, where are they at from a tenderness, from a sensitivity standpoint? And he has a number of these, which again isn't a red flag, but these are points just to maintain, to monitor, and to make sure that he's able to keep that tissue moving properly, to make sure he doesn't have any future arm issues in the coming years. So let's take a look at the strength and conditioning side. Let's check out some of the metrics that he reported. One of the first things that stands out is if we look at the metrics that we're shooting for our college and pro standards, for guys who are trying to throw 95 plus miles an hour, he's about 15 to 20% off a lot of these standards that we've established. It doesn't mean that you can't throw 95 plus miles an hour if you're under these metrics. It just means that this is where we typically like to get guys to before we shift to more power and speed type movements and focus in the weight room. So he is a guy who I would consider, he's kind of out of time this offseason to be ready by February to put on a ton of strength. But going into next offseason, should he continue trying to go for it, continue training, and potentially maybe going from, if he's an undrafted, unsigned, and wants to continue going after it, I would strongly encourage him to go through a 12 to 16 week cycle, adding strength, and see how that impacts his performance. He's a little bit more of an elastic mover, so if we look at his vertical jump test, you can see he's a little bit shallower, a little bit springier off his lower half. He's not super slow, he's not getting super deep in his lower half, he's much more springy, so he is more of an elastic mover. That being said, I still think it's important to get to those strength thresholds before shifting the focus to being more fast twitch and more power oriented stuff. Another clue is his pull downs. So he submitted his 6 ounce, 5 ounce, 4 ounce, and 3 ounce top velocities. And we would normally expect about 3 mile an hour spreads between the different ball weights as you add or subtract 1 ounce from a baseball. So for example, his 5 ounce pull down, 91.5 miles an hour. His 4 ounce pull down, we would expect to be about 3 miles an hour faster than that. He's throwing at 97.4, 6 miles an hour faster. And he's throwing his 3 ounce, another 5 miles an hour faster than that. So he's really good at throwing the light balls. He's not as good at throwing the heavy balls. And that usually shows this is a guy that's more biased towards the speed side, less on the force side. Can we improve his strength and force output? That can typically be a clue. Maybe we focus a little bit more on the heavy balls in his programming. Maybe we get his upper body strength up, and that could even out those spreads and get him those couple ticks we're after as well. From the low back stress fracture side and keeping him healthy, he's not having issues right now, but I probably wouldn't load his spine up super heavy and compress it even further, given the history. So we still want to get stronger, but rather than loading it with back squats, front squats, heavy deadlifts, heavy RDLs, can we be a little bit more low back friendly? Belt squats, where we're bypassing that load from the spine to more of the hips into the legs, sled work, glute ham raises. These are all things I had to do in my own career after having a number of low back issues through college, to still be able to jump 36 plus inches, still be able to throw 98 plus miles an hour, and still be able to, belt squat 550 plus pounds. So there's still certainly ways we can train around that injury and train around the injuries for our remote guys. Next steps would be getting him in-house for a couple of visits throughout the year if he was one of our athletes, getting him on the force plates, getting him on the grip testing dynamometer, the shoulder dynamometer, and the force frame, being able to take some velocity-based training, some VBT numbers, and again, just get deeper insights that can then affect how we program him throughout the rest of the year from that point forward. Let's touch on the nutrition side for a little bit. So nutritionally, again, he's 204 pounds. He put his goal at getting to 212 pounds. He also wanted to be a lower body fat percentage. Those things don't really align, especially with the timeline of the off season. So if we're trying to get 8 pounds heavier and then also lower our body fat by 2 to 4%, right, that ends up being 10 plus pounds of muscle that we're trying to gain in a 2-month period. That's not super realistic. Over a full year, what you would likely do is you'd outline different phases of bulking and cutting. So maybe he goes from 204 to 215 over the summer or next off season. Then he's able to cut back down to 200. Then he's able to alternate these slow bulk and cutting cycles and eventually be a better quality 200 to 205 pounds. But typically you're not going to be able to both target getting leaner and also target bulking and gaining muscle at the same time. You're going to have to alternate phases. We look at his calories. So let's say we are trying to gain weight. He's roughly around 3,200 calories, 3,000 to 3,200 calories based on the food log that he submitted. A couple quick things for those of you watching. Right, this is not enough protein with breakfast. You really want to make sure you're getting minimum of 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight over the course of the day, and then broken down per meal, at least 40 grams of high quality protein per meal. So probably not getting enough protein with breakfast. He's really not getting any vegetables or micronutrients in this diet. Again, it's not necessarily the most important thing, but it can't be zero veggies. Micronutrients still matter from just a general brain function and recovery standpoint. Next level, what some of our pro guys would do, you can get blood work. You can see where different vitamin and mineral deficiencies or hormonal deficiencies might be. And from there, you can start to dial in the supplementation. But I don't like just blanket recommending supplementation to guys without knowing what they're dealing with or what their deficiencies are. He's a guy you probably want to make sure give some basic nutritional knowledge and counseling to, understanding where he's at from a body composition standpoint. Our guys come in-house, they get on the in-body, we're able to get a more objective reading of their body fat percentage and their body composition to get a baseline as they come in a couple of times throughout the year. We can monitor that, continue to track his diet. So using an app like MyFitnessPal to track what he's eating on a daily basis to make sure he is able to get into a consistent caloric surplus or deficit, depending on where he's at throughout the year and what we decided for him. And then again, the supplementation piece completely depends on where he's deficient in. So rather than blanket prescribing, take a bunch of vitamins, it's going to have to be individualized based on the guys that want to take that next step. Let's talk a little bit now about how he might improve his command. Talking about it from the mental side and a couple other angles. Now, if we're just trying to get him down from roughly 5 walks per 9, we just need to get him more consistently in the zone. The first thing is being able to talk to athletes and get in their head and understand, are they more internally focused? Are they more externally focused? What's their intent, their feel, their perception as they go through their delivery? Do they have better command of their fastball than their changeup, than their slider? Like, what's the in-zone rate between each pitch type? Maybe he's in the zone with the fastball, but he can't throw a strike to save his life with the changeup. So understanding how each pitch breaks down. We don't have that information right now. Understanding, is there a breakdown from the bullpen where he might be throwing a ton of strikes in the bullpen, but then he gets in game and that's where the breakdown occurs? Is it only in bullpens when you add in a stand-in hitter or you add in a catcher calling really fine locations that the breakdown occurs? So you're hunting for where the breakdown occurs, where the command starts to suffer. If it's always bad, if it's bad no matter what, always missing to a specific location, a lot of times you start to think, okay, this might be more mechanical. So one thing he put in his assessment, his intake form, is that he has a tendency to miss up and arm side at times. And again, we think about, usually that's a sign a guy's a little bit late or low with the arm at landing, or a little bit forward with the torso posture, which we know he is. If he's a little bit forward as he rotates, the arm's a little bit late, and there can be a tendency for that fastball to miss up and arm side. So there probably is a slight mechanical component to this where we fix that posture and direction, then he could potentially have a little bit better command from that alone. Now we go to the mental side. Totally depends on that conversation and what we can glean from that first conversation or two from what's going on internally. But if he's in a more internal focused state, he's thinking about his mechanics, how can we get him to be more external focused to attack the zone? One cue that I really like for a number of guys that's really helped is attacking the middle. And so thinking more soft focus and looking at the entire zone as like more of a broad area, and you're just blowing it through the center of the catcher and allowing that ball, even if you miss by 12 inches up, 12 inches down, 12 inches in any direction, you're still over the plate and it's still a competitive location, a competitive pitch, versus trying to be super precise right on the corner, super precise right up here. And now if you miss, well, you're way out of the zone, you're way out of the zone, you're way out of the zone. So that's a really helpful way to at least get in the zone and lower the walk rate initially. And then once you start to be more consistently in the zone and actually like, maybe you are getting it middle every time, which we don't necessarily want. Okay, now you can start splitting the plate into halves and start to be a little bit finer with that focus. But shifting that focus from super fine to a little bit softer was a huge key in my career, and I've seen that just repeatedly work for pitchers when that walk rate starts creeping up a little bit too high. Let's simplify the game plan, get them on an ultra aggressive mentality, and go from there. Also, if we go through his personality profile, had him take this tool from our mental skills course, we can see he's a guy that seems to be very routine oriented and seems to do well with that calmer, more carefree personality on the mound, as opposed to that super amped up adrenaline junkie like one of my guys, Will Vest, where he needs to get ultra hyped up and FU mentality to be at his best. So for him, we've got to make sure that he has a pre-pitch routine, given that he says he does better with routines. He also said he doesn't have a routine. And so we need to make sure he's got a pre-pitch routine, he's got a process, he understands how to control his breathing when the game speeds up on him, he understands how to set his focal points and how to reset when the game starts to speed up on him. So all in all, there's a lot that could go into the mental side. We could talk about this all day, but I think if we start there, addressing it from a mechanical standpoint, a mental standpoint, and then as we get into the closer to the season, into the deep off season, making sure those bullpens get as specific as possible. You've got catchers calling pitches, you've got stand-in hitters, you're throwing lives at least 6 weeks out from the season to make sure you're super, super comfortable in that environment, in that game-like environment from the day one of the season. And then one other piece that I think would be helpful for him is our athletes are also given access to a full visualization, meditation, and mental training progression, so they can work through the basic breathing type meditations to more advanced visualization type techniques. This is super important. It's something they can do, 5 to 15 minutes a day in season during batting practice, and just make sure that this is a constant practice once a guy's in season, to be able to control his breathing, be able to stick to his routines. And again, it's something that the pitchers at the very highest level take very seriously, but not a lot of pitchers take advantage of at the high school or college level. And it can really be a game changer if you are the 1 or 2 guys on your college team that actually buys into the mental training stuff. So let's talk next steps. If Gavin was one of our athletes, where would we go from here once we had a much more in-depth remote assessment? So first thing, I've really only covered maybe 25–30% of the type of assessment and the depth that we go into with our remote athletes. So this is giving you guys the very, very tip of the iceberg and just giving you a scope of how all these pieces may come together. But from a stuff standpoint, would want to get him in here before the season started, get him on the motion capture system to establish a baseline, get him on the force plates, both the mound force plates, and then also the force deck and force frame to establish a baseline and identify any of these more subtle nuances, more subtle inefficiencies that we might be able to pick up by getting them on the tech. So that's one thing I would definitely suggest. 2 is split testing that upright posture that we talked about. So being able to get him a little bit more springy out of the back leg, a little bit more up tempo, aggressive drift, and then again, getting his hips underneath him more stacked, which is going to allow him to have a little bit more north-south rotation. Something like a step back Kikuchi drill where you can really hop up and spring into the back leg and give him that aggressive forward move and athletic lower half. I think that would be something I would initially look to try and see how does that affect things. But just recognizing this assessment is just the first part of the process. It's this ongoing communication, ongoing trial and error process and collaboration process with the athlete. So as good as an initial assessment might be, that's really not the end game. Different athletes are going to respond differently to that first program. Different athletes are going to interpret different things. And so recognizing like the value in TREAD, the value in this is not in a one-time assessment. It's in that ongoing 12+ months of back and forth problem solving with their coach. From a command standpoint, I really want to start to understand what are his in-zone rates for different pitch types and where can we maybe affect the walk rate by leaning into certain pitches or figuring out how do we affect the focal points on, let's say, a changeup or let's say the sweeper to lefties. Wherever we can identify those gaps are really happening from a command standpoint, I think there's some low-hanging fruit there for sure. Getting him on the TrackMan, getting him on the edger, and troubleshooting what that bridge pitch could be, whether it's a cutter, whether it's a gyro slider, or whether it's more of a death ball shape. I think that's a game changer and wouldn't take very long to make sure that's a game-ready pitch before the start of this season in a couple months. And then finally, making sure that he has enough time to actually challenge his mechanics and challenge his arsenal in more game-like situations and under pressure. So being able to get him out here or making sure that he's throwing in live situations and making sure that he's testing his arsenal in game situations he's going to encounter once the season starts. If you're struggling in your career, if you made it to the end of this video, first off, you're like the 1%. You're the guys who are hungry to get better, whether you're in high school, whether you're in college, whether you're a pro guy just trying to pick up 1 or 2 little morsels in these videos. You are literally the guys that TREAD exists for. So take advantage of our team. You can get on a call with our team for free. Reach out, we'll talk to you, we'll take a look through your mechanics, we'll chat with you about your situation. And again, that's the one thing I would just really encourage you. I thought I could kind of do everything myself through high school. I pieced together everything, I pieced together programs. And I really wish looking back that I had saved myself the time and just had somebody who'd been in those exact same shoes to work through collaboratively with me, to troubleshoot with, to send video to. So that's what we exist for. If nothing else, reach out, use us for that. Use us just to take a call with our team and just see if we can't help point you in the right direction. Final thing, if you guys would want to see us potentially fly Gavin out here, take him through an in-house assessment, get him on the tech, get him on the mocap, and document what that day and that process might look like, drop a like down below. If we get enough likes, we'll make that happen. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.